Dr. David Heyman is a virus hunter. In the rainforests of West Africa, he hunts for clues that will unlock the mystery of the latest, and for many, the scariest virus, Ebola. He watches it rise out of the forest in the rainy season, jump the species barrier from its unknown jungle host to humans, burn red hot and lethal, turning tiny villages with names like Kikwit and Yambuku into front-page news, before slithering back into the forest, leaving only the graves to remind us of its passing. Scientists nervously wonder what might happen if the deadly virus mutates and goes airborne, like the flu. With no vaccine and no cure for those it infects, Ebola could jump from one continent to another in a few weeks, killing millions. But no one, not even the virus hunters at our most sophisticated laboratories, can find the natural hideout of this elusive killer. Suddenly, clues emerge from the rainforests of the Ivory Coast and Gabon. Expeditions into the jungle find an epidemic of Ebola raging through bands of chimpanzees. Somehow, like humans, our closest cousins are being accidentally mugged by the virus. In South Africa, scientists find a link between the chimpanzees and fruit bats. David Heyman is hopeful that Ebola is on the verge of giving up its secrets.
It's the mystery around Ebola, the mystery of what's not known, that attracts me, and I think that attracts a lot of people. We don't know where Ebola hides in nature, but we do know that man, at some point, gets involved in this cycle, which is in nature, and becomes an accidental host, an accidental carrier of this virus, and he dies.
The mystery of where these epidemics come from taps a timeless horror. For European peasants, it was plague at the castle battlements. For Native Americans, it was smallpox in their teepees. It is the mystery that makes us all feel vulnerable, no matter how safe we think we are. It is the mystery that makes Ebola a symbol of emerging disease in a world out of balance. The trumpet of a coming plague. Years ago, when Ebola first broke out in the village of Yambuku, Zaire, David Heyman was a young disease cowboy with the Centers for Disease Control. His job was to prepare the portable isolation chambers for doctors who might be accidentally infected fighting the epidemic. Today, as director of the Office of Emerging Diseases at the World Health Organization, Heyman is on the front lines of epidemics around the world. Like all virus hunters, Heyman has learned a lot about how to contain an epidemic. But Ebola still kills 8 out of 10 people it infects, and no one knows when or where it will break out next.
We don't know where Ebola comes from, and we don't know what its real potential is. If Ebola gets into a hospital in a capital city in Africa where there are poor hospital practices, it can do much, much more damage than we've seen it do so far in small rural areas.
Recently, another clue emerged from the Bio-Level 4 laboratories of South Africa. Fruit bats tested positive for Ebola. These findings give Heyman and his team an incredible opportunity. The chance to observe firsthand the interaction between bats and an ongoing epidemic of Ebola in a band of chimpanzees that scientists know very well. Where they travel, what they eat, when they sleep, and how they interact with other animals. Heyman believes this detailed knowledge will lead scientists to the source of Ebola. To put scientists on the same level as the chimpanzees, an elaborate catwalk is constructed hundreds of feet up in the rainforest canopy. Dr. Pierre Formanti, who heads the World Health Organization's research team in the Ivory Coast, is the expert guide.
Do the chimps sleep up in the trees at night?
Every night they nest in the trees, yeah.
During his first visit to the research station, Heyman joins Formanti in a search for one chimp who has just died of Ebola. In the jungle, there is no north or south, no horizon line, no sun, only a constant misty drizzle. An hour's walk from the road with a small compass gets them close, but Formanti and his assistant are led to the spot by an overwhelming smell.
Over there.
Maggots and other animals have stripped the chimp to skull and bones.
So this is the first one that's died this year? Is that right?
That we know, yeah.
Yeah.
Some are missing this year,
Yeah.
but it's the first one that we discovered the body.
The outbreaks among chimps seem to occur every 2 years, which leads Dr. Formanti to speculate that the virus may be tied to the bloom of rainforest fig trees, where thousands of insects, birds, bats, and mammals gather to feed.
It could be easy for a virus to go from one species to another species and to do a cycle around this type of trees.
Because Heyman and Formanti must touch the decaying remains of the chimp, which may be covered with live Ebola virus, they must wear double gloves and masks. They are nervous but hopeful. For the first time, they believe they are in the right place at the right time to begin the search. This is just where every virus hunter wants to be. It is hard to imagine an outbreak of Ebola in the United States. It seems so far away, so remote. But within this century, a dozen diseases have terrorized Americans with the same ferocity as Ebola does now in Africa. Our grandparents lived in constant fear. Polio, influenza, meningitis, pneumonia, diphtheria all took their toll on American families, while doctors stood by helplessly. Then, almost overnight, science began to answer back. Antibiotics tamed bacterial infections. Powerful pesticides knocked out the mosquitoes that carried malaria and yellow fever. Vaccines eliminated many of the worst childhood viruses. But success was tempered with failure. One frightening disease refused to fall: polio. No disease in this century has spread panic in the country like infantile paralysis. It not only killed, it left a crippling legacy. Summer after summer, one generation after another. Children went to bed healthy and woke up crippled, gasping for breath. It struck the poor and the rich alike, even presidents, and it defied treatment.
We don't know how lucky we are and how much we have to be thankful for with our health and our happiness.
Judy, and that's why we should do all that we can to help all of those who can't help themselves.
I know. Can I put a dime in your envelope?
Oh, you know that you can.
A nation exhausted by depression and war somehow found the energy for a march of dimes to fight the deadly virus. Hundreds of the country's brightest scientists devoted their lives to stopping polio. Among them, Dr. Jonas Salk. In the mid-50s, the nation's prayers were answered, and a new kind of hero was born.
It's very easy to lose our history. One of the truly dramatic moments in the history of the United States was April 12th, 1955. It was announced that the Salk vaccine protected children against polio. The next day, around the United States, there were signs in store windows, "Thank you, Dr. Salk."
Americans embraced this new era. Scientists and doctors with a social conscience and a can-do attitude were confident that they would see the end of infectious disease in their lifetimes. The age of optimism was in full swing.
Part of my interest in infectious diseases is very personal. In the 1940s, I had septicemia or blood poisoning and was treated with penicillin. And I recall the doctor saying to my father, 2 years ago he would have died. And so that's getting in right at the beginning of an era.
Like other American doctors drawn to the fight against disease on a world stage, Bill Foege found his way to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. The CDC had been set up originally to lead the fight against malaria. Over the years, funded by the government, the CDC had taken on new crusades. Its most ambitious, a bold international public health campaign, the global eradication of smallpox. Smallpox is a uniquely human virus. We are its natural host. A vaccine was developed at the end of the 18th century by British scientist Edward Jenner. But 150 years later, smallpox remained entrenched in dozens of poor countries and was still killing 2 million people a year.
I think ideas are like infectious agents, that there's an incubation period, and that a few people have this vision of smallpox could be eradicated. Thomas Jefferson had that vision. In 1806, he wrote to Edward Jenner and said, future generations will know by history only that this loathsome disease has existed. And Jefferson, by the way, got vaccine as early as 1801 and vaccinated his household and his neighbors. And he gave vaccine to Lewis and Clark to take west with them in 1804. So people had this vision, but there's an incubation period where enough people get the idea that it actually is doable.
Smallpox was the first international test for the CDC. Into the field went intrepid teams of doctors from a dozen countries, including Bill Foege, David Heyman, and hundreds of disease fighters from the CDC. They confronted civil wars and natural disasters. They chased smallpox until outbreaks of the virus were isolated, smothered, and conquered. Their heroics energized the medical world and inspired young doctors. More evidence that in this age of optimism, microbes were no match for scientists. Bill Foege returned triumphantly to Atlanta and soon became director of the Centers for Disease Control. Anything seemed possible. The eradication of polio, measles, perhaps even malaria. The smallpox campaign had raised everyone's expectations.
In the 70s, I think there was a false optimism. At the time, we perceived it as an era when diseases were decreasing. Smallpox was disappearing. Other diseases were easily controlled by antibiotics, and I think we built up a false security. What we didn't see, though, was how the world was changing.
The world's population was healthier and better fed than it had been in 10,000 years. Infant mortality was declining, and people were living longer. It followed almost as a celebration of human ingenuity that the population of the world would explode. Four billion people lived in a world that had been home to 2 billion only 40 years earlier.
We didn't stop to think about the population explosion. We knew we were on an exponential curve of population increase. What we didn't know is that, what we didn't think about is how our cities would cope with this.
Dirt road shantytowns with no electricity, no sewers, and no health services swallowed the world's largest cities. And in the countryside, settlers pushed farther into the forests, where humans had no experience, recreating the environmentist farms and settlements. No matter how remote an outbreak, the world was shrinking, and the landscape of disease began to change. Dengue fever jumped from Southeast Asia to Cuba, Brazil, and Venezuela on its way to Texas. New strains of hepatitis and drug-resistant gonorrhea circled the globe and settled in American cities. Malaria emerged in places it had never been before. Most troubling, a group of deadly hemorrhagic viruses that doctors could barely identify erupted in epidemics on every continent. These emerging epidemics called for a different breed of disease detective, molded in the tradition of Walter Reed and the men who exposed themselves to yellow fever to unlock its mysteries. Doctors willing to risk their lives fighting diseases where infection meant almost certain death. Like the Apollo astronauts, these young scientists had their own code, their own way of showing the right stuff.
The mystique was that it was the creme de la creme of young, bright, brash physician epidemiologists who went around stomping out epidemics and things like this, and it had a real cowboy atmosphere to it. It was like the Lone Ranger coming into town and killing all the bad guys. It was really a remarkable ego trip.
There's nothing that draws people closer together than going to war together. We were at war against disease together.
They learned a great deal from those rough field experiences.
Age-old concepts of sanitation.
Lessons they hope can be used to prevent future outbreaks.
And in the last 15 years, the vector, the mosquito that
Tom
carries
Monath
this
worked in the
virus
CDC's
has
laboratories
reinvaded
when deadly viruses were still studied on open benches.
There was a real macho attitude towards working with these dangerous agents, but the ethic was you have to work in this kind of environment if you're going to get anything done.
There was Kent Campbell,
we
a
don't
small-town boy
like
from
sanitized
Tennessee who
society.
started out looking for a way to avoid a 2-year stint at Saigon General Hospital and ended up as one of the world's leading authorities on malaria.
And there was a tremendous esprit de corps, which had a certain rowdiness to it. It had a can-do attitude about it, and it also had a lot of sharing. It was about as seductive a thing as you would ever imagine.
Oh, that's absolutely right.
Joe McCormick had already spent 2 years in Zaire, teaching math and science at a Methodist mission school before he became a doctor. He knew firsthand how much pressure poor people in Africa were putting on the natural environment.
Modern life has brought people into places they haven't been before, and has created a situation where people are moving into what was once the territory of the viruses and the hosts that they inhabited.
Back in the early 70s, Jim Curran would never have described himself as a cowboy. He wasn't loud or cocky. But in the end, his career led him straight to AIDS, the most mysterious and deadly epidemic the modern world has ever lived through.
The reputation you guys had, I mean, of people who would be brash and arrogant enough to think that you could go to anywhere in the globe with whatever scientific technology you could muster and get things done.
Over and over, these cowboys were put to the test in small countries like Sierra Leone that most Americans had never heard of.
First thing that happened to me is Lyle Conrad, who's one of the great fathers of the program there, walked down the hall and said, "Hey, Campbell," I didn't know him from anybody, "Campbell, we're looking for somebody who wants to go on a short-term trip to West Africa. There's this problem called Lassa fever. Are you interested in doing that?" The truth of the matter is that we'd have killed each other to go. There were 20 people who said yes, and none of them could spell Lassa fever.
Scientists knew almost nothing about Lassa fever. It provoked the same mysterious terror in the 70s that Ebola provokes today. Lassa and Ebola are classified as hemorrhagic diseases, a complicated name for a simple, horrific process of destruction going on inside the body. Hemorrhagic viruses invade the cells that make up the body's organs. The tissues become saturated with fluid. In a short time, the cell walls dissolve, fall apart, turn to mush. The patient bleeds to death from the inside out. Lassa was, in the language of the cowboys, a slate wiper. It seemed to kill everyone it infected.
72 hours after leaving Atlanta, I'm standing there with a gown on with Tom in a room that has 3 pregnant women who are in the process of dying of Lassa fever, and we're there and we're face to face with this problem, which was a nightmare.
We wore respirator masks. That was the best thing we had in those days. They're little black masks that would fit over most of your face, and it had a funny filter on the front of it, and we also were gowned up and had hats and gloves on. And we looked like men from outer space to these people. They'd never seen anything like this before.
One of the things we did to help the women breathe better was to put a small tube into their space around their lungs to try to let some of the fluid come off. There was no anesthesia, and we were sticking these tubes in, and these women were so desperately ill that, I mean, it was ghastly. And then as the fluid came out, it was under such pressure, it just came out all over us.
In a split second, the doctors were awash in their worst nightmare. They were covered with Lassa virus. It would not be the last time these doctors would risk their own lives to find answers. Every epidemic, every outbreak is an important case study in the war against plagues to come. Under the shadow of their own exposure, the CDC team kept searching for Lassa's mysterious natural host.
I was after the secret. That was the key, the reservoir of this disease. Until we knew that, we really couldn't develop any kind of a prevention strategy.
After weeks of frustrating setbacks, suddenly success. Tom Monath solved the puzzle. It was a small African rat, Mastomys natalensis, that finally emerged as the natural host of Lassa. Daily life in the villages of West Africa created a constant low-level exposure to the urine and feces of the rats, and occasionally people were infected with Lassa fever. But when diamonds were discovered in Sierra Leone in the 1950s, the equilibrium between human communities and the rat population changed overnight.
Towns sprang up where they never existed before, rapidly. People moved from other areas into towns, and much was just like the gold rush towns of the United States were terrible places from the sanitation point of view, crowding, and all of the infrastructure that we normally think about in a human civilization are ignored in order to make room for this economic opportunity.
The rat population exploded, and a virus that had existed on the outskirts of human settlement erupted in the crowded mining towns. But that didn't explain why hospitals were such raging hot zones. The answer was painfully simple. Kent and his colleagues, working feverishly to trace the origins of the epidemic, discovered that when the worst-case infections in the countryside became too sick for families to tend, they were brought to the clinics, where needles and syringes were poorly sterilized and often reused, where nurses rarely wore gloves and were awash in blood, urine, and bedpans.
You know, the sort of tragic part of this whole thing was that you had these mission hospitals in which there were these incredibly motivated, dedicated expatriate workers there, and to a large extent they were transmitting Lassa virus in the process of attempting to take care of people in these incredibly primitive sort of an environment.
In one death-defying expedition, CDC doctors had discovered the natural host of a deadly virus and solved the riddle of why Lassa fever exploded in hospitals. Kent and Tom headed home with just the kind of cocky confidence bred by such an adventure. And then, on his way through Europe, Kent spiked a fever.
It was like a thunderbolt hit me. I had high fever and I felt horrible, and worse than I ever felt in my life, and it hit me very quickly.
Terrified that Campbell might spread Lassa fever, CDC leaders convinced the Air Force to bring Kent home in the Apollo containment capsule. It had been designed to protect humanity from otherworldly Andromeda strains that might infect astronauts on trips to the moon. Back in Atlanta, Monath rushed Campbell's blood into the lab. Negative. But just what virus had infected Kent remains a mystery.
I think I've got a much clearer appreciation of the fact that there's probably a lot of this around us, and that we ascribe many illnesses around us to convenient and well-known entities, and there may be more of these things around us, and it's only when they cluster and there are a lot of them, or when they're real serious, that we take note of them.
2 weeks after he returned to work at the CDC, Kent Campbell received a bill from the Air Force for the trip home, $17,000. By 1976, it was Joe McCormick's turn to lead the charge against Lassa fever. He set up a lab and sponsored community education, theater, and rallies. Slowly, the rates of Lassa fever began to come down. But then the civil war in Liberia spilled over into Sierra Leone, and the CDC was forced to shut the project down. Now, every few months, news trickles out. Lassa is spreading again. Joe McCormick was just setting up his Lassa lab when something bloody started killing people in Zaire on the banks of the Ebola River at a mission hospital in the village of Yambuku.
They didn't know what the epidemic was at that time, and the speculation was that it could have been Lassa, it could have been Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, it could have been Marburg disease.
It was becoming clear that Lassa wasn't the only lethal virus marauding through Africa. All the emerging epidemics had a similar modus operandi, a virus never seen before, an elusive host that emerged unpredictably from the disturbed ecology of the rainforest, a special affinity for unsanitary hospitals, and a very high death rate. Joe rushed to Zaire, along with the team of doctors from the CDC and the best tropical disease centers in Europe. 325 people died in Yambuku, 150 more in the Sudan, and then the world's first known outbreaks of Ebola simply disappeared. 3 years later, Joe McCormick got his second crack at Ebola in the village of Nzara in the southern Sudan.
I was examining an old woman and had my needle actually in her vein to draw a blood specimen. And I thought, because she was old and fairly frail, I thought that I could hold her arm without any problem. And she really lurched, and the needle slipped out and went right into that thumb right there. And so that, I knew what that meant. I had been around with Ebola enough to know what that meant. And, that was one of those mistakes that you make. I was in a hurry. I was trying to get things done, and I was tired. It was, the conditions were difficult, but that's part of the territory, if you can accept to do this.
1,000 miles from nowhere, it was the worst thing that could happen to Joe. A colleague gave him plasma and a stiff shot of Johnny Walker Scotch. He went to sleep.
I visited her every day to be sure she was still alive. I had been testing her serum every single day because I knew one of two things. If she died, I was in trouble. If I saw antibody even before she died, I was going to likely to be in trouble. So every day was a little bit of a deep breath for me as I sat and looked down the microscope at these slides that I'd prepared. And every day, fortunately, hers was negative. That wasn't true for everybody else. Hers was negative. And finally, the day that she recovered, I took another blood sample from her, and I said, this is it. If she's recovered and she has no antibody, I can be reasonably sure that she did not have Ebola. It was negative, and I knew I was out of the woods.
For Joe, the hands-on experience with Ebola would change forever the way he viewed the battle between humans and microbes.
I learned a really important lesson in the thatched-roofed huts of Nzara in Sudan and in Sierra Leone. These hemorrhagic viruses are scary enough without making them into science fiction. Doctors don't need space suits to treat patients or space capsules to move them about. Mostly we need compassion and common sense, gloves, surgical masks, barrier nursing, and proper sanitary procedures.
Unlike smallpox or polio, we are not the natural hosts of these exotic viruses. We blunder into them when we crash into their natural environments. When we do get infected, these viruses incubate so quickly and are so lethal that victims are easily identified, isolated, and epidemics are contained. That's what happened in Kikwit in 1994 and Gabon in '95. For Joe McCormick, this has been the most important lesson of a life spent fighting hemorrhagic viruses.
Ebola withers in the face of proper hospital procedures. It isn't going to sweep around the planet killing 1 billion people. That's just not the way it works. If I were going to imagine a real terror, it would be a deadly virus that kills 100% of its victims, but incubates so slowly, say a decade, that millions of people are infected before anybody knows about it. It would be a virus that's transmitted sexually, attacking young adults while it takes advantage of our social inhibitions and bigotry about sex.
In the early 1970s, while the world's attention was focused on the triumph against smallpox, just such a deadly virus quietly emerged and swept the world. September 1983. For 3 years, a strange, unknown disease has been rampaging through the gay communities of New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. At the CDC, disease detectives are stumped. Healthy young men in the prime of life are dying from infections that will not respond to treatment. Their immune systems have crashed. For some, the unnamed disease takes on a larger meaning.
I believe that when one breaks the laws of nature and the laws of moral decency, and I do believe homosexuality is moral perversion, we do reap it in our flesh when we violate the laws of God.
Foolish, really, because there's never been a disease that can only be homosexually transmitted. But nonetheless, the denial, the emotional quarantine, the ghettoization of the disease, keep it in the gay community, keep it away from me, someplace I can't identify with, was very, very powerful. I hope sooner.
Jim Curran was the perfect choice to lead the CDC's investigation of the emerging epidemic. He was already in charge of the Sexually Transmitted Disease Research Branch. He was brilliant but low-key. Just the sort of calm voice needed as this mysterious and controversial epidemic exploded. When Curran heard the first reports from Dr. Michael Gottlieb, a young immunologist at UCLA, he suspected that a new infectious agent was the cause. But that conclusion didn't go down easily.
There was a lot of skepticism about an infectious agent. People were aware that smallpox in the world was nearly eradicated. Antibiotics were in their heyday, and bacterial strains resistant to all antibiotics hadn't emerged. We seemed to be ahead of the curve, ahead of the microbes.
While this mysterious killer was still confounding the best disease detectives in the U.S., doctors in Central Africa were 4 years into their own mystery. A similar killer was having its way in Central Africa, but no one was paying attention. It's hard to imagine a more remote and peaceful part of the world than the Kagera district of Tanzania, on the western shore of Lake Victoria, near the Ugandan border. But in the 70s, these villages were the scene of a vicious war between the troops of Ugandan dictator Idi Amin and the Tanzanian army. Throughout history, war and sexually transmitted diseases have gone hand in hand. So it came as no surprise to any of the doctors stationed at the provincial hospital in Bukoba that they were in the middle of an epidemic of venereal disease. But they were also seeing something new.
These STDs were not healing and the people were not improving and discharged home in good condition, but deteriorating and dying.
For several years, villagers around Bukoba had complained of a disease that was attacking young adults. Some called it slim disease. Doctors thought it might be tuberculosis. Against a backdrop of constantly evolving tropical infections which caused fever and weight loss, it could be almost anything. With no laboratory and only a few trained doctors, precise diagnosis was all but impossible. Whatever it was, the epidemic spread quickly from the army camps to the villages, from the villages to the cities. And back and forth along the way, prostitutes serviced the supply lines that stretched from the Ugandan border to Dar es Salaam. Baffled by the withering disease, doctors at the hospital pooled their own money and sent Dr. Clint Kayamurakunge by ferry boat across Lake Victoria to the medical school at Dar es Salaam. He carried blood and tissue samples. The laboratory in Dar came up empty. But in the medical library, he found a few articles about a new disease emerging in the United States and Europe. Among them, the articles by Michael Gottlieb describing the first AIDS cases in Los Angeles. Everything matched. Well, almost everything.
What was not typical was the fact that those cases described in the literature had risk factors, risk behaviors. They tended to be drug abusers, homosexuals, people who had been on medication for hemophilia. And none of these cases that we were describing in Kagera seemed to fit in those categories because they're just ordinary people.
Doctors on 2 continents were thrown off course, and the wasting disease continued to spread. Back at the CDC, Joe McCormick kept his eye on Africa. On a gut level, all the reports led him to suspect the unthinkable, that a deadly virus had finally emerged out of the jungle to crowded cities and was rapidly spreading around the world. With Curran's encouragement, he headed for Zaire.
The initial epidemic investigation in Kinshasa was very dramatic. I mean, we found 38 cases that we later confirmed in like 3 weeks, and that was quite striking. That was much more than we expected.
But it wasn't just the numbers of victims that caught Joe off guard. It was the way this disease was changing African families.
But I remember seeing this young woman in her 20s lying in a bed with bed sores, totally emaciated in the Mamiemo Hospital in Kinshasa. And I found out from one of the nurses that this young woman was from Wimbonyama, the very town where I taught school 20 years before. The nurses there told me that no one ever came to see her and that she was completely alone. And that just doesn't happen in rural Africa, in African villages. Death is something that is an integral part of the culture. How someone is treated at death, the fact that their family is with them, and that they're seen through the death into the next life is a critical part of culture of Africa. I think I went away from that saying, this is a total catastrophe in Africa.
Joe McCormick came home with one simple, shocking observation. The plague that was rampaging through the homosexual communities in the United States and Europe was the same plague spreading between men and women in Africa. It could not be dismissed as a byproduct of the gay lifestyle. Everyone was vulnerable. AIDS was going global, and Africa was just taking the first hard hit. Along the shores of Lake Victoria, Tanzanians struggle to restore their lives to normal in the wake of AIDS. But it is impossible. Almost a third of the women are infected with the virus. Thousands of children are orphaned. The social fabric of the villages is stretched to the breaking point. In the roadhouses, barmaids insist on the use of condoms. And on the waterfront, earnest public health activists distribute them by the thousands, offering short courses in how to wear them. But AIDS has taken its toll. There is a desperate resignation. Almost no one wants to be tested for AIDS. What's the point?
Act up! Fight back! Fight AIDS! Act up! Fight back! Fight AIDS! Act up! Fight back! Fight AIDS! Act up!
In the United States, the battle is still on. New medical breakthroughs may be on the horizon, but a cure, a vaccine, or even effective, affordable treatment is years away.
The real risk in the U.S. is that we begin to accept this, perhaps because of fatalism, perhaps because of denial, perhaps because of some emerging ignorance, and that as we accept it, it becomes acceptable in our society. It's just part of our landscape, like the citizens did in the plague, when they said, our neighborhood only has 20% of people dying. It could be worse. We could live in that neighborhood where 40% die. That's how new epidemics become invisible and become part of our life.
All across the world, the landscape of disease is changing. AIDS is shredding the veil of optimism in which we wrapped ourselves. Almost 7 million people have died. 23 million more are infected, and we are only beginning to feel its impact. The publicity and focus on AIDS masks the devastating re-emergence of diseases we thought we had conquered. As the century closes, cholera breaks out in Peru. Diphtheria attacks Russia. Hepatitis sweeps through Pakistan. Drug-resistant gonorrhea evolves in Southeast Asia and circles the globe. Lyme disease, hepatitis C, Legionnaires, Hantan, and deadly strains of E. coli bacteria shocked the United States. Last year, 60,000 people died in American hospitals from infections they did not have when they entered. Around the world, malaria infects 500 million people a year. And tuberculosis has re-emerged to become the world's leading killer once again.
20 years ago, when I came into this field, there was a sense that infectious diseases were on the verge of being controlled, and that the war against infectious diseases could be won after all. I think there's more concern today that that's really not achievable. There are going to be specific successes. There are also going to be spectacular failures.
This is not the world we imagined for ourselves and our children a half-century ago when the age of optimism began.